This era tells how the first generation of American gangsters earned the names that made them legends. Their nicknames came from scars, habits, scams, and moments of violence, marks that followed them through the rise of organized crime and into history. It started in Brooklyn, New York, January 17th, 1899. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born to Italian immigrants from Naples. His father, Gabriele, cut hair for a living. His mother, Teresa, worked as a seamstress. They wanted a quiet American life, but Brooklyn in the early 1900s wasn't quiet. It was a place where opportunity often came with a price. As a teenager, Capone ran with street gangs like the South Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors. He met Johnny Torrio, a man who would later become his mentor. Torrio saw something in the young Capone: ambition, nerve, and a mind for business hidden under a tough street attitude. The nickname Scarface came long before the world knew his name. Around 1917, while working as a bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, a club owned by mobster Frankie Yale, Capone made a crude remark to a woman at the bar. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, took offense. He pulled a knife and slashed Capone 3 times across the left side of his face. The wounds ran from his cheek to his jaw. The scars stayed for life. Capone later claimed the marks came from war injuries, though he never served in the military. He hated the nickname Scarface. He preferred to be called Big Al, or simply Capone. But reporters loved the name. It fit the image, the gangster with the dangerous grin and the scar to match. In the 1920s, Torrio brought him to Chicago, where Prohibition turned illegal liquor into a gold mine. Capone rose fast. By 1925, after Torrio was nearly killed in an ambush and retired to Italy, Capone took control of the Chicago outfit. He ran speakeasies, breweries, brothels, an empire built on booze and muscle. His power reached into politics and law enforcement. The violence that came with it, from the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre to constant gang wars, made him both a celebrity and a public enemy. In the end, it wasn't murder or bootlegging that brought him down. It was tax evasion. In 1931, Capone was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He served time in Atlanta, then Alcatraz. By the time he was released in 1939, syphilis had destroyed his health and his mind. Al Capone died in Florida on January 25, 1947. He was 48. To history, he remains one of America's most infamous criminals, a man whose scar became a symbol of the violent era he helped define. He was born Benjamin Siegel on February 28, 1906, in Brooklyn, New York, the son of poor Jewish immigrants from Austria-Hungary. The Lower East Side, where he grew up, was crowded, tough, and full of kids trying to survive by any means. Siegel wasn't built for factory work or small-time hustles. He had a temper that burned too hot for either. As a teenager, he ran with other street toughs, pulling robberies, shakedowns, and bootlegging runs. That's where he met Meyer Lansky, another young hustler with a sharp mind for money and discipline that Siegel lacked. Together, they formed the Bugs and Meyer Mob, a small but lethal crew known for protection rackets and contract killings. That's where the nickname came from. Bugsy, slang for crazy. It wasn't a name he liked. In the underworld, men said Siegel had a hair-trigger temper. If someone crossed him or insulted him, he could explode in violence without warning. To his face, almost no one called him Bugsy. They called him Ben. But behind his back, the name stuck. It fit the legend: unpredictable, charming, and dangerous. In the 1930s, Siegel and Lansky helped form what would later be known as Murder, Inc., the enforcement arm for the National Crime Syndicate. Siegel became a trusted killer for the mob, operating under the cover of legitimate businesses. He was smart, stylish, and connected. By the 1940s, Siegel had moved west to California. There, he mixed with Hollywood stars, producers, and socialites, while still running rackets for the East Coast Syndicate. He brought organized crime to the glamour of Los Angeles, gambling, bookmaking, narcotics, and labor control. But his most famous gamble came in Nevada. Siegel envisioned a luxury casino in the desert, the Flamingo Hotel. He wanted to create a resort that could rival anything in the world, where Hollywood met the high rollers. Construction costs spiraled out of control from a projected $1 million to over $6 million. His partners in New York started to suspect he was skimming money. On June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel was sitting in the Beverly Hills home of his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. He was reading the Los Angeles Times when gunfire shattered the window. He was hit multiple times, 2 bullets struck his head. He died instantly. The next morning, the mob quietly took over the Flamingo. Siegel's dream lived on, the beginning of modern Las Vegas. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel remains one of the most famous gangsters of the 20th century, remembered not for his madness, but for the vision that changed the American underworld forever. He was born Ralph James Capone on January 12, 1894 in Angri, Italy, the second oldest of 9 children. His parents, Gabriella and Teresa Capone, brought the family to America when Ralph was still a boy. They settled in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood thick with immigrants chasing the same dream, a better life. The Capones worked hard, his father cut hair, his mother sewed, but the streets of Brooklyn had their own economy. Ralph's younger brother, Alphonse Al Capone, would one day become the face of organized crime. But before that, Ralph was the older brother, the steady one, the man Al looked up to. In the early 1910s, Ralph followed Al to Chicago, where Johnny Torrio was building an empire in bootlegging and gambling. Ralph helped organize the outfit's legal front businesses, breweries, soft drink companies, and distribution warehouses. His sharp eye for logistics earned him his nickname, Bottles. On the surface, it referred to his role managing the family's bottling operations during Prohibition, the legitimate side of the beer racket. But it also fit his personality. Ralph was the one who handled the flow, the numbers, and the cover stories that kept the beer moving and the cops confused. While Al ran the show, Ralph kept it supplied. He managed the breweries, arranged shipments, and made sure the outfit's profits looked legal. Behind his calm manner was a businessman who knew how to launder millions. Under his management, the Chicago outfit's soft drink and bottling front became one of the largest legitimate beverage distributors in the Midwest. But Ralph wasn't a peaceful man. He could be violent when challenged, and he carried the Capone name like armor. After Al's conviction for tax evasion in 1931, Ralph briefly tried to fill the void, but he lacked his brother's charisma and control. The outfit's leadership soon passed to Frank Nitti, and Ralph's influence faded. In 1932, federal agents turned their attention to him. Ralph Capone was convicted of tax evasion, the same crime that brought down Al, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. After his release, he moved to Wisconsin, settling near Mercer, where he ran a small tavern and lived quietly under the name Ralph Bottles Capone. Unlike Al, Ralph never returned to the spotlight. He stayed in the background, managing small businesses, occasionally surfacing in news stories about the Capone family. By the 1950s, his criminal life was over. Ralph Bottles Capone died on November 22, 1974, in Hurley, Wisconsin. He was 80 years old. He never ruled an empire or made the papers like his brother. But behind the breweries, the trucks, and the fronts that kept Prohibition alive, Ralph was the man who kept the beer flowing, the quiet accountant of the outfit's golden years. To Chicago, he was the Capone who stayed in the shadows. To history, he was proof that every empire needs someone to keep the bottles filled and the books balanced. He was born Yakov Faktorowicz on October 8, 1892, in Łódź, Poland, then part of the Russian Empire. His family were Jewish, poor, and looking for a way out. When he was still a child, they left for America, joining the flood of immigrants who landed in Chicago with little more than a name and a dream. In Chicago, the boy who would become John Factor learned a trade, cutting hair. He stood behind a barber's chair, razor in hand, listening to the talk of men who ran the city's darker corners. Customers came in for shaves, left with whispers about money, liquor, and opportunity. Somewhere along the way, Yakov became Jake. That's where the nickname came from, Jake the Barber. At first, it was literal. He was a barber. But later, it meant something else, a man who could trim fortunes, not hair. By the 1920s, Jake wasn't cutting hair anymore. He was cutting deals. He ran swindles and stock frauds across Europe, posing as a financier and selling worthless shares to wealthy investors. The scams earned millions and made headlines in London. When British authorities came after him, he fled back to the States and straight into the arms of the Chicago outfit. In Chicago, Factor connected with men like Al Capone and Frank Nitti. He fit in easily. Smooth talker, clean suits, the kind of man who didn't need a gun to steal a fortune. But the law didn't forget. In 1933, while fighting extradition to England for fraud, Factor suddenly vanished. It made front-page news. Millionaire kidnapped until he turned up days later, bruised and shaken, claiming he'd been held for ransom. The government blamed rival gangster Roger Toohey, who swore he'd been framed. Years later, evidence showed Toohey was telling the truth. The kidnapping had been a setup, staged by Factor himself to dodge extradition and win public sympathy. It worked. Factor never went to England. Toohey went to prison for 25 years. By the 1950s, Factor had reinvented himself as a businessman and casino operator. He helped finance the Stardust Hotel in Las Vegas, a Chicago outfit property used to skim millions from the gaming tables. On paper, he was legitimate. In practice, he was still part of the machine that turned Vegas into a mob cash register. He gave money to charities, posed with politicians, and built an image of respectability. Few people dared mention the frauds, the kidnapping, or the lives destroyed along the way. John Jake the Barber Factor died on January 22, 1984 in Los Angeles. He was 91 years old. He'd started life with a razor in his hand and ended it with millions in the bank. To law enforcement, he was one of the slickest con men who ever lived. To the mob, he was proof that you didn't always need a gun to pull a job. And to history, he remains what his nickname always hinted at: the man who could take you for everything and leave you smiling when he did. He was born Ciro Terranova in 1889 in Corleone, Sicily, the same town that produced generations of mafia men. His family came to America in the late 1890s, settling in East Harlem, New York. It was a neighborhood packed with Sicilian immigrants where street markets ran on both cash and intimidation. Ciro grew up watching how power worked. His older half-brothers, Niccolo and Vincenzo Terranova, were early members of the Morello crime family, one of New York's first organized mafia groups. They taught him that control didn't always come from violence. Sometimes it came from business, or from the threat of it. By the 1910s, Ciro had found his own niche. He began buying up artichokes from California growers and reselling them at inflated prices to vendors across New York. It wasn't a simple produce business. It was extortion dressed as commerce. Terranova's men controlled who could sell, who could buy, and how much they paid. Anyone who tried to import artichokes without his approval found their shipments destroyed or their stalls burned down. That's how he earned his nickname, the Artichoke King. He had turned a vegetable into an empire. By the early 1930s, Terranova was pulling in thousands of dollars a week from the racket. He controlled the entire artichoke market from the Bronx to Lower Manhattan. It became such a scandal that New York's mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, launched a personal crusade to break his grip. In December 1935, LaGuardia famously banned the sale of artichokes in city markets altogether, a political move meant to humiliate the mobster who'd made them his gold mine. The ban didn't last long, but it broke Terranova's monopoly. Meanwhile, the underworld he'd once helped shape had changed. The old Sicilian bosses were fading, replaced by younger men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, who modernized the mafia into a corporate syndicate. Terranova, old-fashioned and isolated, was pushed aside. He lost money, lost influence, and by the 1930s was struggling to hold on to what he had left. His health began to fail. The man who had once ruled New York's markets with quiet fear was now living on the edge of bankruptcy. On February 20th, 1938, Ciro Terranova was found dead behind the wheel of his car, parked near his home in East Harlem. He'd suffered a heart attack. In the front seat was a bag of unsold artichokes. He was 48 years old. Ciro, the Artichoke King Terranova, never built casinos or empires. He didn't run drugs or gambling. He ran produce and ruled it like a kingdom. To New York, he was the first mobster to turn an everyday market into organized extortion. And to history, he was a symbol of how the early mafia learned to make power look legitimate, one vegetable at a time. He was born Lester Joseph Gillis on December 6, 1908, in Chicago, Illinois, the fifth of 7 children in a working-class family. His parents were Belgian immigrants. His father worked as a tanner, his mother raised the kids, and for a while it looked like a normal life. But Chicago's streets had their own gravity. By the time Lester was a teenager, he had already fallen into petty crime, theft, car break-ins, stick-ups. He wasn't tall, and his round, boyish face made him look younger than he was. But beneath that calm expression was a hair-trigger temper. Friends called him Babyface, half as a joke, half as a warning. The nickname stuck for life. By 17, he was already in reform school. By 20, he was an armed robber. He joined small-time gangs, ran with car thieves and bootleggers, and proved himself violent even by their standards. In the late 1920s, he was working for Tough Tony Notaro, hijacking trucks for the Chicago outfit. But Nelson wasn't built to take orders. He was too impulsive, too proud, and too fast with a gun. In 1931, he robbed a bank in Chicago and was caught soon after. He escaped custody and fled west, linking up with other outlaws. Over the next few years, his name began to circulate in law enforcement circles. A dangerous, unpredictable man who moved like a storm across the Midwest. His life changed when he crossed paths with John Dillinger, the charismatic bank robber whose crew was turning crime into headlines. Nelson joined Dillinger's gang in 1934. They robbed banks from South Dakota to Indiana, leaving blood and chaos behind. Nelson wasn't like Dillinger. He didn't care about charm or planning. He loved violence. He shot guards, police, even bystanders if they got too close. The newspapers called him Public Enemy Number 2, right behind Dillinger. The FBI called him a killer with no restraint. When Dillinger was gunned down outside Chicago's Biograph Theater in July 1934, Nelson became the most hunted man in America. But he didn't run far. He stayed in the Midwest, robbing banks with his wife, Helen Gillis, and a small crew that refused to quit. On November 27, 1934, his run ended outside Barrington, Illinois. FBI agents spotted his car and gave chase. The gunfight that followed became one of the most violent in Bureau history. Nelson was hit multiple times, but he kept firing, killing 2 federal agents, Sam Cowley and Herman Hollis, before escaping. He bled out hours later, dying in his wife's arms. He was 25 years old. Helen turned herself in the next day, leaving his body wrapped in a blanket by the side of the road. Lester Babyface Nelson was dead, a young man whose nickname hid the brutality inside him. To the public, he was the babyface killer who smiled while shooting it out with the law. To the FBI, he was proof that the outlaw era wasn't built on romance, it was built on rage. And to history, he remains a reminder of how the Great Depression didn't just make criminals, it made legends out of men who lived fast, killed often, and never planned to grow old. He was born Arthur Fliegenheimer on August 6, 1902 in the Bronx, New York, the son of German Jewish immigrants. His father left when Arthur was still a boy, leaving his mother to raise the family alone. That absence shaped him. He grew up angry, quick-tempered, and drawn to the streets where respect came from fear, not family. He quit school at 14 and started working at a nightclub in the Bronx, learning how fast money moved in the underworld. During Prohibition, he found his calling, bootlegging. Liquor was illegal, but demand was everywhere. Arthur joined the trade, hijacking trucks, bribing cops, and running beer across the city. Somewhere along the way, he changed his name. He didn't want to sound like another immigrant kid. He wanted something sharp. He called himself Dutch Schultz. Dutch was a nod to his German roots. Schultz was borrowed from a neighborhood tough whose reputation he admired. Together, the name sounded like someone you didn't cross. By the late 1920s, Schultz controlled one of New York's biggest bootlegging operations. His organization moved thousands of barrels of beer each week. He operated from the Bronx but extended his reach into Manhattan, Harlem, and upstate New York. He made millions and killed freely to keep it. Schultz was brutal, unpredictable, and paranoid. He fought constant wars with rivals, especially Vincent "Mad Dog" Coll, a former associate who turned against him. When Coll tried to muscle in on Schultz's territory, the feud turned bloody. Coll was eventually gunned down in a phone booth in 1932. No one was charged, but everyone knew whose orders were followed. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Schultz shifted to new rackets, numbers, gambling, and extortion. He set up his headquarters at the Harmony Hotel in Harlem and forced local bookmakers to pay him tribute. He was making millions, but he couldn't control his temper. He beat his own men, threatened judges, and bragged too loudly about the money he was hiding from the IRS. That brought federal prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey into the picture, the same man who would later bring down Lucky Luciano. Dewey charged Schultz with tax evasion. Schultz beat the case once on a technicality, but Dewey kept coming. The pressure drove him to desperation. In 1935, Schultz proposed killing Dewey outright. The Mafia Commission, led by Luciano and Lansky, refused. Dewey was too public, too dangerous a target. But Schultz wouldn't listen. Word got out that he planned to do it anyway. On the night of October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was eating dinner at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. 4 gunmen from Murder Inc. walked in and opened fire. Schultz was hit multiple times in the stomach, liver, and chest. He didn't die right away. Doctors tried to save him, but after 20 hours of fever and delirium, he was gone. He was 33 years old. Arthur Dutch Schultz was buried in Yonkers under his real name. To some, he was a bootlegger who built an empire from nothing. To most, he was a violent reminder that in the end, luck and money couldn't buy loyalty, and no man, no matter how feared, could stand alone against the world he helped create. He was born Salvatore Lucania on November 24th, 1897 in Lercara Fridi, Sicily, a small mining town outside Palermo. His father, Antonio, was a sulfur worker. His mother, Rosalia, wanted her children far from the poverty of southern Italy. In 1906, they boarded a ship for New York and settled on the Lower East Side. For young Salvatore, America meant crowded tenements, long days, and quick lessons in survival. By the time he was a teenager, he'd stopped using his birth name. He started calling himself Charles Luciano. He ran with the kids who didn't have much but wanted everything: gamblers, thieves, and street hustlers. He met Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, both teenagers like him, both with sharp minds for money. Together they formed the backbone of what would later become the modern American mafia. The nickname Lucky came early, but the truth behind it depends on who you ask. Some said it came from the way he survived the streets, always walking away from close calls with the law. Others said it was ironic, a bit of street humor. The most famous story goes back to 1929. Luciano was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. He lived with a scar on his face and droop in his right eye that never healed. After that, people stopped calling him Charlie. They called him Lucky. Through the 1920s, Luciano worked under Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, one of New York's old-school mafia leaders. But Luciano saw the limits of that old world: loyalty over business, bloodlines over profit. He began dealing with Salvatore Maranzano, Masseria's rival. It was a dangerous double play, but it worked. In 1931, during the final days of the Castellamarese War, Masseria was shot dead in a Coney Island restaurant. Luciano had arranged it. A few months later, Maranzano followed, murdered in his office by Luciano's men. With both bosses gone, Luciano took control. He reorganized the mafia into a national syndicate, 5 families in New York, each with its own boss, all connected by a commission that settled disputes and managed business. He turned organized crime from a family feud into a corporate system. He moved into narcotics, gambling, and labor racketeering. For years, he ruled quietly, keeping alliances with men like Lansky and Frank Costello. But power draws attention. In 1936, New York prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey charged Luciano with running a massive prostitution ring. Luciano denied it, but he was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Even behind bars, he still had influence. During World War II, US naval intelligence reportedly reached out to him, hoping his contacts in the docks could protect New York's waterfront from Nazi sabotage. After the war, the government commuted his sentence. In 1946, Luciano was deported to Italy. He settled first in Naples, then later in Havana, where he tried to rebuild his empire. US pressure forced Cuba to expel him, and he spent the rest of his life in Italy, still connected, still powerful, but far from the city he once controlled. On January 26, 1962, Charles "Lucky" Luciano collapsed from a heart attack at Naples International Airport. He was 64 years old. He was buried in Queens, not far from the streets where he started. To law enforcement, he was the architect of organized crime in America. To the men who followed him, he was the one who made it modern, the man who got lucky by surviving long enough to build an empire.